Hello everyone and welcome back to The Rest Isn't Orthopedics with myself and Prof. Johansson. And Grace has asked us whether she needs a hip operation or not. And today we're going to talk about the legal and ethical frameworks behind the consent process and why that's so important.
Hello everyone. So an operation is something done by her surgeon, and explaining and consenting Grace for surgery is generally something done by a senior surgeon, not by a junior. But the whole process is something that I think all of us on the ward need to understand. I don't consent people for surgery, the nurses don't, the therapists don't, but we do handle questions constantly from patients who are facing an operation, who want to understand more about what's happening and what they have or haven't agreed to.
And I think this is also particularly relevant to those in medical school, but especially those aiming for medical school. The ethical principles underlying the consent process come up time and time again in interviews, so really being able to get a good understanding of those will put you in really good stead.
Okay, Rayhan, so she's in front of you, she's asked you the question. What do you think would need to be part of the consent process for her?
In terms of the consent process, I think I would start by explaining the procedure to Grace and the main benefits she would get from a hip surgery.
What are they?
So mainly, I guess, being able to get back on her feet, which is incredibly important, but also the pain aspect, which we talked about in the last podcast. So she'd be in a significantly less amount of pain than she is previously pre-surgery.
Yeah, surgery is the way of dealing with the incident pain of an unfixed fracture, and getting back onto your feet without surgery is really, really difficult. It's not impossible, but it's really difficult.
And I think afterwards I'll try explain, I guess, to me what the major risks are. So whether that be bleeding, infection.
Okay, so the chances of bleeding and infection are perhaps 0.5 or 1% of patients?
Would we maybe talk about some more common side effects such as delirium? I know that's quite common.
Yeah, so delirium is almost inevitable. In half of the patients we see will have cognitive difficulties, and delirium is really, really common. So it's vastly more common. Most consent forms that I've ever seen don't mention delirium at all. They talk about pain and infection and bleeding. They may talk about further fractures, but they don't talk about what the patient's really going to feel like when they come back from theatre, which is with a different sort of pain and often confused with delirium. So getting that get into the consent process is really key.
Yeah, and then I think I'd also try to explain what the procedure actually involves. I don't think I'm particularly qualified, as I'm not really a hip surgeon or any type of surgeon yet, so I think getting someone more senior is very important.
Yeah, so we'll get a senior surgeon to talk to us in a podcast about what the surgical options are. But from where she's sitting, she's going to go off. She's going to have an operation. She's going to come back from theatre with a scar on her leg and a dressing on that scar, and her pain will have changed. And she doesn't know, and frankly, looking after many people like this, I don't really know or mind very much what the piece of metalwork is in there. Patients do tend to get very excited about what operation have I had, doctor, but actually it doesn't really make any practical difference to her or her nurses or her therapists. There are very few ways in which the type of operation really alters what we're trying to deal with, and the perioperative concerns that we elaborated in our first podcast.
And I assume Grace might have some concerns, so I'll try to really, at least, or maybe the senior surgeon would be a lot better placed to dispel any concerns or questions she may have.
Yes, she needs to know what she's going to feel like when she comes back. She's going to have questions about risk, and people do have concerns about risk, and we've talked about that in the past. It's very easy to think of her as being at high risk, but what we mean is that she's at higher risk than you or I would be having an operation. But the overall levels of risk with an operation are very, very small, and even the sickest of our patients, 99% of them, come through the operation without a difficulty. So risk is not high for her.
And finally, I think it's very important to inform her of the benefits and risks of any other possible treatments, or whether that even be no treatment at all, and what the positives and negatives of that might be.
Yeah, so capturing all of that is really complicated. There's a lot that you might need to tell her to go through. There's risk percentage figures for risks and so on that some people will want to know. They will want to know the details. Many patients will simply say, whatever you think best, doctor, and leave it to you. But if she wants to know much more detail, you don't know the answer to that. I don't really know the answers to that. We need to be in a position to give it to her, and we therefore need some form of written patient advice to support the consent process. And if you don't have something that's written and available to you, then you really can't be claiming that you're legally respecting the patient, respecting her autonomy, and giving her the chance to make a choice, which is the key thing that's happening here. We know Grace. We've talked about her in a number of podcasts. We know that she's competent, she's capable of making decisions for herself. So we need to be respecting her autonomy in making a choice. But we can't do that if we can't give her all the information she needs. And one of the things that we can attach to the chat behind this podcast is the information sheet that was developed by one of your predecessors, Aruba Imtiaz, which is a multilingual, 20-language translation of a patient advice sheet that was constructed by one of the orthopaedic registrars, Mark Ramsden. And what we have is that in a QR code that people on our ward can just link up to and download translations of patient advice, giving them details of different operation types, the risks, and every piece of information they could possibly need as part of the consent process. And that's a freely available resource anybody can use. And I think it is fundamental to giving her choice, is for her to have all the information that she might want. Most people won't, but some people do.
And in terms of non-operative management, so if Grace wasn't to get hip surgery, what's her outlook? I know we've talked about patients here in the UK, and at least from what I've seen on the wards and in and around, I've not actually seen a patient who hasn't gone to theatres for a hip surgery.
Yeah, so one of the things that the consent process needs to do in presenting her with a choice is a choice between one operation and another, but between one operation and not having that operation. And that does need to be something that's thought about. 97% of people in the UK will have surgery. We have about 1% of patients who are so sick that they die before we can actually get them to theatre. We have about 1% of patients in whom the fracture is either healing when it first presents, or the two pieces of bone are impacted, jammed together, and will heal up and don't need an operation. And then about 1% of people are just physically not fit to have an operation at all. But 97% of people will have an operation. And that means that the process when somebody presents to hospital, it's nearly always they're going to go to theatre. And we've got a very rapid pathways developed in hospital to get people ready for theatre, because we know they're going to need to go. And that rapid process can distract you from the possibility that there is an alternative. It's a rare alternative, and it's quite difficult to divert people from surgery in the UK. There's been some really interesting work done in Holland, where society thinks differently about end-of-life care in Holland for all sorts of reasons. There's much more openness and dialogue about dying, and there is much more of a recognition there that not operating may be an appropriate intervention for some patients. We'll have to get people from Holland to talk to us about what they've developed, but there is the possibility there for patients to be offered non-operative end-of-life care in hospital and potentially in a care home, which is something that the UK is just not set up to deliver at the moment. So non-operative management is an option, but it's very, in my experience, it's a very unpleasant and difficult thing for people to cope with. If you can't be moved, turned in bed, can't get good pressure care, can't be toileted with dignity with a broken hip, dying like that is very difficult. And even for people who are in the last weeks of life with advanced cancer or something like that, we will tend to do surgery as a palliative procedure. We will tend to offer surgery as a palliative procedure, and that is very much the norm in the UK.
And I think it's really interesting looking at different models of healthcare and how they differently deal with patients. So I guess it's safe to, well, I think the term best interest is in of itself quite interesting, but it's safe to say it's not always in the best interest of our patients for them to have surgery.
Indeed. When people start trying to reduce conversations about ethics to the expression best interests, I feel really uncomfortable. I think medically, ethically and legally I feel really uncomfortable, because often when doctors, surgeons talk about best interest, what they're saying is what they think would be best for the patient. And they tend to be weighing up the benefits that you talked about, the risks that you've talked about, and they're putting one against the other and making a decision, often between two operations, without really dealing with some of the issues that we've talked about. That balance between what we call beneficence, the obligation of doctors to do something that will benefit their patient, and non-maleficence, our obligation to do no harm, that tends to be wrapped up and called best interests, and people start telling patients what's in their best interests. That's not what the consent process is about. The consent process is about a third fundamental ethical principle of autonomy, the right of a patient to make decisions for themselves. And those three ethical principles can get out of balance if you just focus on beneficence and non-maleficence, just start talking about best interests. So I think it's an uncomfortable phrase, and I try and avoid using it at all times.
And I guess we've talked about beneficence, non-maleficence and autonomy. There is also a fourth ethical principle, which is justice.
Yeah, and justice is the one that people always forget, and is really, really important. I think that the way I think about justice is that justice is about the implications for other people. So we know that Grace has got a broken hip. We know that she is capable of making a decision. She's likely to agree that surgery is the right thing for her and to want to get on and have an operation. But that just may not be the right thing for today's operating list, because on the same intake we may have seen another patient who's been admitted with an open ankle fracture that's potentially going to get infected. He's likely to be a younger person who's working. It's got implications for him, his earning potential, his family, his entire future. There's an emergency about trying to take him to theatre. We could equally have a road traffic accident with one or more people admitted with major injuries. And Grace doesn't have the right. Ethically, we would be wrong saying, well, Grace is here and we've got to respect her beneficence, non-maleficence and her autonomy and take her to theatre, because we've got implications for other people. So the balloon debate of who, the balloon is sinking from the sky and who do you throw out of the basket to make sure that you stay up, that balloon debate about how today's theatre list is organised will mean that other people have a right, and we can step away from our duties in terms of beneficence, non-maleficence and autonomy in terms of justice, and there's implications for other people. And in other countries that's even more so. So in some countries the whole consent process just almost doesn't exist. The expectation is that people will do what the doctor tells them. In some cultures the autonomy of the patient is wrapped up in decision making, which is decisions are made by the extended family or by senior members of the family who will make decisions on the patient's part. Those sort of scenarios can be really uncomfortable when they crop up. They're not something that we necessarily feel confident with and comfortable with in the UK, because it's so unusual as an approach. But it is very much the approach in some countries around the world. And you have to recognise that in some countries where if Grace breaks her hip, she and her family will have to find the money to pay for the prosthesis that she needs to have put in, and that the cost of that prosthesis might be higher than the family's income for the next month or two. A decision will be the justice will mean that the decision as to whether she has surgery does need to be made by her family, not just by herself, because the choice for the family is, do we do the operation for grandma, or do we feed the children? So issues of justice are really important, and I think understanding that justice is there is a great protection when you're dealing with more complicated ethical decisions. And we see lots of ethical problems cropping up in healthcare. Whenever I feel uncomfortable about something that's happening on the ward, I go back to these 4 ethical principles. I don't try and make a decision, I think I know what's best. I try and make a decision that refers to all 4 of the ethical principles. So if later on in her stay she's becoming frustrated at delays in getting home and decides that Grace decides she wants to go home, she may try and take herself out of hospital before she's ready or before we think she's optimized. And I'll then need, in deciding whether to support her or how hard to press her to stay in hospital, we'll need to think about the benefits to her psychologically and practically of getting home, the risks, the possibility of a fall or something like that. I'll need to respect her autonomy. I'll need to check that she's still able to understand and weigh up the pros and cons of going home from hospital. But I also need to remember the justice work, because that's the bit that reminds me that I need to talk to her family, and her family might need to come in and talk to her. There are implications of her going home for other people who may be responsible or who might end up bereaved if something went wrong. So that the only patient in the room is not Grace. There are other people who are part of that equation. Her family do need to be respected in the process of consenting for a rash decision or a complex decision, or in the case of what we've been talking about, a big operation. Are there members of the family who need to be aware of what's going on? Do the family know that she's actually going to theatre? Has anybody warned them that she's come in and is going to have surgery tomorrow? Has the family been made aware in case something does go wrong?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Prof. I think that's a really neat and tidy way to package the 4 pillars of ethics and really help explain that to within the concept of consent, and to explain the 4 pillars in and of itself. And hopefully in our next podcast we can, dive in a bit deeper and really talk about what the operation of a hip fracture procedure involves, which would be interesting. And look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much.